All right, there we go. Okay, so now it's recording. So as I said, we're going to finish off part 3 of program design. So after we finish this lecture, we're going to kind of shift our focus into program design for aerobic training. So we're going to be finishing talking about resistance training, and then we're going to shift our focus into the aerobic component. So let's just start with a little bit of review from what we did 2 weeks ago. So I know for some of you that might have felt like a long time ago. So I do want to just kind of review what we finished off with last week. So one important part we talked about was the 1RM prediction table, right? So if you're not directly assessing someone's 1 repetition max, which you might not, you could actually predict their 1 repetition max, which might give you a better idea of when you're prescribing weights for a client. And we said that after 10 reps, this chart is not as accurate. So ideally, you do want to get your client to do 10 reps or less if you were doing a 1 rep max test here. So let's go through an example. Does anyone want to give me a weight and how many repetitions were completed? And you could even choose an exercise like bench press or squat, maybe where you have done a certain weight, and we can get a predicted 1 rep max. Anyone want to give me a number, weight and repetitions less than 10? $225 for 8, Evan. Thank you. So was that, what exercise did you do that for? If, I mean, maybe you made it up, but if it is related to you, then let me know what exercise. So 220, okay, so 225 for 8 reps for a squat. All right, so barbell back squat. Okay, so let's review. What do we do? So what's the first step? What do we do first? And feel free, if you want to hop on your mic, it might be easier. What do we do first? So we know that Evan did 8 repetitions with 225, and this is pounds, obviously. So I'll kind of guide you as we go here. So first, there's my ugly arrow, but we need to see what percent of 1 rep max that would be. So if you're doing 8 reps, that is equal to 80%. Okay, so now we know that, okay, well, 225 for 8 reps was 80% of Evan's max. So do we remember the math of how we do this? So we take 225, what do we do with it? You got it. Thank you, Michael. So 225, I'm gonna put, I guess, the like just a dash because I don't have obviously a division sign, but 225 divided by 80%, right? So 0.80. And obviously, it wouldn't make sense if you multiplied it because you're gonna get a smaller number, right? So whenever we're trying to find a maximum, we're going to divide it by the percentage that we get from the chart. So what is our answer here? 225 divided by 0.8. 281, I will confirm with you, 225 divided by 0.8, 281.25. So yeah, we can round to 281, okay? Good. So that would be Evan's predicted 1 repetition max for his back squat, okay? Any questions? Do you want to go through one more of how to calculate 1 rep max? It's not a complicated equation to do or anything like that, but if you want one more to practice, we can do one more. Do you want anyone say yes if you want to do one more? Yes, okay, Liam, perfect. We'll do one more. Does anyone want to give me another set of numbers? So a weight and how many reps? Write in a different color. $245 for 5 for bench press. Okay, so 245 times 5 repetitions. Okay. So what percentage does that equal to? What percent of 1 rep max does that equal to? 5 repetitions. 87%. You got it. Yep. So what do? We do 245. What do we do next? Yep, divide by 0.87. And that's how I'm just going to write out divide. So what do we get as our answer? Yeah, 281. So actually the same, right? So 281.6. Yeah, we can round up 282. Okay. Awesome. Okay. So actually, doing those different rep schemes, we get the same predicted 1 rep max. So that's funny how that works. Let's see, Jillian. For email and password. Okay, Jillian's just having an issue getting in here. Sorry, let's see if I can I invite someone. Give me 1 sec, guys. Invite. No. Sorry, guys, 1 sec, because she does need to get in here, and I don't know why it's not working. Thanks, Zoom. Sorry, 1 second, guys. Okay. Interesting how that's not working. I don't know if anyone else has been having issues, because I know some students had mentioned. I don't know why that some people are having issues, some are not. Okay. So I see your question there, Vivida. Is it similar because the weight is more, but the reps are also less? Exactly. So it ends up working out to be about the same because, yeah, for sure, the weight is heavier, but the reps are lower. So if you do the math, it ends up working to be the same. So that's just how the math worked out. Obviously, you know, if Evan was doing higher weight for 8 reps, obviously we're going to get a higher 1 rep max, right? Okay. So hopefully that makes sense and we're comfortable with doing these calculations, because for sure on your final exam, you will get at least 1 calculation for this. Okay, and also just so you know, the other way around. So let's say I said, I want the client to work at 75% of their 1 rep max. Okay, you would know their 1 rep max already, right? If that was the case. So let me just get my text over here. So if you knew their one rep max, so let's say their 1 rep max for squat was 250 pounds. And I was like, you know what, today I want you to work at 75% for a certain amount of reps. All I would do is take the 250 times 70%. Whoops. And then I would be able to then get 70% of their 1 rep max. In this case, what do we get? 175. Okay, so for that session, thank you, Yesha. Yep. For that session, the client would be working with 175 pounds. So I could ask you either way. I could ask you to get a 1 rep max, or I might ask you, okay, well, I want you to work at a percentage of the 1 rep max. All you would do is just multiply their maximum by the percentage. Okay. Any questions about that? I'm going to take a no and we shall continue. Whoa, okay, all my text is still there. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to practice and see what you remember now for sets and repetitions that we covered before your test for both beginner, intermediate, and advanced clients. And then we're looking at strength, power, hypertrophy, and endurance. So let's take a look and see what you remember. So let's look at beginner first. And so how many sets would we recommend for a beginner? And this would actually be across the board. So what is the sets for a beginner? You got it, Evan. Yep, 1 to 3. Awesome. So it should show you there. And we said for power, we don't recommend doing power for a beginner. So 0, right? No sets for power, right? So that would just be for beginner to do either strength, hypertrophy, endurance. Now we talked about this. What would we recommend a beginner to start with? Strength, hypertrophy, or endurance? Endurance, yeah. So I'd recommend a beginner client who doesn't have much experience with training to start with muscular endurance. You got it. Yep. So that is beginner. So what is the beginner rep ranges if we were to prescribe, which again, we most likely won't, but for a beginner, what repetitions per set would you recommend? For strength, sorry, for strength. So what repetitions for strength? So that's not strength. Remember, what is the rep ranges for strength? It's less than 6, okay? And as I said, most beginners are not going to do that anyways, but again, if for any reason you might, it would be less or equal to 6. That is the recommendation for strength. So power, we know we don't recommend. I would even, again, mark out the strength column, but it is there. So again, if you ever did. What about hypertrophy then? What rep ranges would you recommend for hypertrophy? Yeah, it's 8 to 12 for a beginner. You got it. And then endurance? So again, it is 10 to 15. So you're kind of in the range. 10 to 15 is like the recommendation for a beginner client for endurance. Okay. All right. Let's move to intermediate. So how many sets for an intermediate client? Okay, so again, based on the chart, you're kind of there. So it would be greater than or equal to 3. Okay, and that would be across the board. If you were to prescribe power for an intermediate client, it would be like 1 to 3. Okay, sets if you were to do power. So greater equal to 3 for intermediate. Okay, how many repetitions per set for strength for intermediate? So again, for strength, it's going to be less than 6. It's actually less than 6. That's going to be across the board, just so you know. So even for advanced. So less than 6 is strength. And again, you need the appropriate weight to stimulate the adaptations for strength, right? So it needs to be heavy weight, low reps. Okay. That would stimulate strength. What about power? How many reps? For power, it's actually going to be the same as strength. So, or like 3 to 6. Okay, so 3 to 6 repetitions for power. Okay, again, you're working with moderate level weights. But again, remember when we talk about power, we're focusing on speed, how fast we can move those weights, okay? What about hypertrophy? How many reps? Hypertrophy? Anyone? Close there, Evan. It is 6 to 12. Okay, so 6 to 12 reps for hypertrophy. So you are right, you're in the range, but you can go to 12, would still be considered hypertrophy. Okay. And what about endurance? What are the recommended rep ranges for intermediate for endurance, muscular endurance? So it's actually the same as beginner. It is also 10 to 15. Okay. So you'll see it's the same for both beginner and intermediate for endurance for rep ranges. Okay. The only one that's different is hypertrophy. So it goes from 8 to 12 to 6 to 12. Why does it decrease to 6? Because then the client can actually handle more weights and get that adaptation from working with the lower reps, but heavy enough weight. Whereas a beginner won't be able to really get the benefit of hypertrophy with the weights that they're probably choosing because they're not going to be heavy enough to stimulate the hypertrophy. Okay. All right, let's go to advanced. So how many sets for an advanced client? Sets for an advanced client? Anyone awake? Yep, greater or equal to 3. Okay, that's pretty much across the board. Power puts you between like 3 to 6 because I mean, your form might start to decrease greater than 6. So greater or equal to 3 for everything except power, where we kind of cap it at 6. What about repetitions for advanced client for strength? Okay, so close, it's still 6. Okay, so across the board, you're going to see 6, right? All the way through. So 5 is correct, but it is, the cutoff is 6. What about power? How many repetitions? Close, 1 to 6. Okay, so now that the technique should be better, the client might be working with slightly heavier weights in the power range. You might be able, now you can do sets of like 1, where you're going to get the benefit. Whereas for someone who's intermediate, still going to probably be learning a lot of technique and not with maybe as heavy load. So that's where we see rep ranges a little higher. Okay, and again, think of those power exercises as like your cleans, your snatches, clean and jerk, hang cleans, anything like that. Those like Olympic lifting movements where we're trying to lift the load quickly with good technique, does require a lot of technique. That would be applicable for power. Okay, so even a deadlift, moving it quickly would technically, you could consider that as power. Okay, so what about hypertrophy? How many repetitions? You got it there, Michael, 6-12, yep. So again, same as intermediate, we see the same rep ranges there. Okay, and then last but not least, endurance. So this one goes a little higher now as someone gets more advanced, up to 25 repetitions. I mean, you could even do more, but 10 to 25 is actually sufficient for endurance, because now again, as someone builds up their muscular endurance, they could handle some more reps because the weights are not going to be very heavy. Okay, again, depending on the client's goal and what they want to achieve. If they are doing 25 reps easily, but their goal is more towards hypertrophy, then you're going to want to increase the weight. Okay, so hopefully that was a good review of the rep ranges, okay, and the set. So this is definitely something you do need to know and remember, and this will carry over into personal training too as well. So this is not something you want to forget. So really helpful if you were able to memorize these numbers, because it's very easy when you're programming, then you know what numbers kind of to choose for your clients. Now, remember, we also talked about the loads, right? The percentages of the 1 rep max that you would have the client training at. So as we know with strength, you're going to be working at the highest loads, so above 85% of someone's 1 rep max. And again, someone needs to be a little bit more advanced and have good technique to be able to work at those loads, right? And then with power, we see slightly less, right? Depending how many repetitions you're doing, the more repetitions you're doing, you're going to work at a lighter load, right? Lighter percent of 1 rep max. We see hypertrophy somewhere between 67 to 85% of 1 rep max. And then endurance, we see much lighter loads, something under around 67%. Again, they're estimates, but at the end of the day, you'll have that client going through that exercise with whatever weight you've chosen, and let's see how many reps they can do, right? If they're doing well over 20 repetitions and their goal is hypertrophy, well, then obviously you might want to increase the load a bit, right? But for someone who's a beginner, just learning, 10 to 15, 20 repetitions is okay, and the loads might not be that heavy, and that's okay. All right. So again, that's all review. So now we're going to go into today's topic, which again is part 3. So we've already gone through some of the steps of program design. We have talked about how we can determine load. As I've said as well, does come from some experience. Again, most of the time you'll just start at the lighter weight on a lot of the machines or the dumbbells, and then you can work up from there if it's really a beginner client. But if you are working with someone more advanced, you're going to want to maybe find a way to measure their 1 rep max if you can do it directly, or if you would like to predict it, you can, and then you might get a more accurate prescription of a load for them. As well, I mean, you can also go by the client's feel, right? Like that feels really heavy. You know, okay, I'll do a 5 repetition max. We talked about that as well, where you could program repetition goals, right? So I want to do 5 today, or I'm going to do a 10 repetition max, and then I'm going to find a weight that gets me there. And I don't know what weight I'm going to do, but I'm going to increase my load until I get to that. Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about volume today. We'll talk about rest periods, which we've touched on already. We'll review that again. And then we'll kind of just finish off kind of the sequential training methods. How would we program, you know, over time and what that might look like? That's going to be more into PT2, not necessarily as much here. This is just kind of the basics of creating a program to start someone off with. So we've already gone through the first 5 steps here. And we're going to talk about volume today. We're going to talk about rest periods, training variation, how to sequence the plan. Again, that gets very complicated as we start looking at like a year time frame, for example, and how can we progress? So we'll talk about some examples of how you might progress your client over time. So let's start off talking about volume. Okay, so what is volume? How do we figure that out? Okay, so remember what we talked about, and before I continue, remember I mentioned in class last week, 2 weeks ago, I said for someone who's working at a high intensity, and you can tell me, are they going to work at a high or low volume most likely? So high intensity, what volume, high or low? You got it, Evan. Yep. Yep. So high intensity, low volume. If you were doing high intensity, high volume, especially for a long time, you're most likely going to get injured, you're going to burn out, and you can't sustain that level, right? So a lot of the time with programming, you're going to waive periods of high volume, lower intensity, and then we can increase intensity and lower the volume, and you might waive that throughout a period. So it could be like a 3-month block where we maybe focus on a little bit higher intensity, lower volume, and then another 3-month block where we might focus on lower intensity, but high intensity, and then higher volume, higher intensity, lower volume. The opposite as what I said before. Okay, so again, usually you're not going to increase both at the same time. And usually, depending on what you're doing, you're not going to really decrease load and volume at the same time. Okay. So when we talk about volume, when we refer to it, and we'll talk about some definitions here, but when we say volume, we kind of look at this as the total amount of weight I've lifted in a session. So if I did, let's say 100 pounds for 5 repetitions, I kind of did 500 pounds of volume. You can look at it like that. We're going to look into more specific definitions in a second. And when we talk about sets, we're talking about how many reps you've done consecutively before you rest. So if you did 10 reps in a row, and then you needed a break, you just did 1 set of 10, right? And so every time you rest, that is the end of a set, okay? So I hope we understand those definitions, and sets we've talked about already, so hopefully you're familiar with what that means. So when we look at volume, volume is largely determined by number of sets. So if I were to want to increase volume for a client, if I increase, let's say I increase the reps from 10 to 15, but I kept the sets the same, that's not going to increase my volume a lot. But let's say I kept my reps at 10, but I added a whole nother set. I just did an extra 10 reps of that weight, which is more than just increasing the reps, if that makes sense, right? So sets is a primary determinant of volume. So if you wanted to increase volume for a client, add more sets. Now, don't go crazy and go from 2 sets to 5 sets. Just adding 1 set might be enough to be that volume stimulus that will give that client maybe some more results that they're not getting from the lower volume. So for beginners, it's okay to do 1 set. So 1 set is enough stimulus for a beginner to stimulate adaptations, okay? Because again, understand there's a lot of time focusing on technique, a lot of neuromuscular coordination going on, right? So anything that they do will cause increases in strength, okay? So it's important to understand that 1 set is okay for beginners. You don't have to program 3 sets for a beginner, okay? So that's something important. It's okay. And again, some beginners might be able to handle a little more depending how physically active they are. So in that case, maybe it's okay. You can give them 2 sets, right? So here's the 2 definitions that you do need to know. You need to know the difference between repetition volume and load volume. When we talk about repetition volume, we're just talking about how many reps I did in a session. So you might look at that as a way to monitor some volume for a client, and that's only looking at reps and sets. So I'll take my reps times my sets, and that will give me my repetition volume. So we can do an example. Let me draw here. So I did 10 repetitions and I did 3 sets, right? So what is my repetition volume? Well, 10 times 3, we're going to get 30 reps. Okay, so I did a total of 30 reps through my whole workout of that exercise, right? So we can look at it as specific exercise, how much repetition volume for specific exercise, or you might look at repetition volume over a whole workout. So if you had 10 exercises, 10 times 30, you do 300 reps in the whole workout, right? So we can look at that if we want, or we can just look at per exercise if that's something I'm looking at. And so when do we care about volume? It's when we're looking at a program over a period of time, right? If I wanted to make changes over time to a program, I want to make sure volume might slowly be increasing as my client adapts, especially as a beginner. Their volume might be a lot lower, so you might need to increase volume. And then if you're looking at someone who might be more advanced, you want to make sure that we're not just overloading and increasing volume all the time, there should be periods where we're decreasing volume as well. So that's when we care about volume over a period of time. If we're just looking at like a 2-week program, we're not really as concerned. But when we're looking at progression over time, we want to make sure the client is having enough volume in their program to provide stimulus. Okay. The next definition is load volume. So this is the total amount of weight you've lifted in your session. And that is taking, now my annotation's still on here. That's going to take your reps times your sets times your weight. Okay. So now we're taking all 3 components and we're going to multiply them together. So let's make an example. So let's take the same amount of reps that I did before. So I did 3 sets of 10. So I did 10 reps times 3 sets times, let's pick a weight, I don't know, 50 pounds. Let's say for chest press, for example. So now I'm going to do 10 times 3 times 50. So what do we get? Who wants to do some math with me? It's going to be 150. 1,500 pounds. You got it. So when we talk about load volume, we actually talk about it in weight. Okay, so I did a total of 1,500 pounds for this exercise. And typically when we're looking at load volume, you're probably going to look at this for your core movements. And so this can be like your squat, your bench, your deadlifts, perhaps like if you're doing some rows, again, we're not maxing out. And again, we might look at overhead press, we might look at some power exercises, as we talked about, like those cleans or power cleans. And again, if you're not sure what that looks like, please go ahead and Google what that is if you've never seen a power clean before. So we can look at the load volume. Again, same kind of idea where we want to look over a period of time. Are we sequencing it and maybe slowly increasing volume over a period of time? And again, how are we manipulating our volume, right? So what we said is we can increase the sets is going to change the volume a lot, right? If I added another set to the weight and reps I've done, so if 10 times 4 times 50, that's going to increase my load volume a lot. Whereas let's say I went from 10 reps to 8 reps and I increased my weight to 60 pounds, we're not going to see as much of an increase in the volume as we would see if we increase sets. However, if you were looking to increase intensity and decrease volume, right, then we might actually lower the reps, keep the sets the same, and increase the weight. And we could also drop a set if we wanted to lower the volume that much. So it depends, again, on what we're looking at and what athletes we're working with and what our goals are, right? But just understanding that we want to look at volume over a period of time to make sure the client is progressing and they do have enough volume to create stimulus. So I believe I have a couple examples here. Yeah. So here's, and let's just delete my drawings from before. Okay. So let's look at a client who's done bench press week 1 versus week 8. Okay. And so we're going to see how we're playing around with the volume, but look at how we've changed the sets and rep schemes, but we didn't change the weight. So let's take a look at load volume in each week. So week 1, the client did 5 sets, 5 reps of 225. In week 8, they did 10 sets. I know that's a lot, but they're doing 3 reps each set and 225 as well. So let's calculate the load volume in week 1 and compare it to week 8. So how do we calculate load volume for week 1? You got it. Thank you, Evan. So 5 times 5, 5 sets, times 5 reps, times 225 pounds, right? And what do we get as our answer? 5,625 pounds. You got it. So that is our load volume in week 1 for the bench press. And we're just looking specifically at the bench press. in week 1. Week 8, we're going to do obviously 10 by 3 by 225, right? So we just multiply everything together for load volume. And what do we get here? So we get 6750. Sorry, I just have to, sorry. All right, 6750 pounds. So which week do we do more load volume? In week 8, right? Which we can always see that's the higher number. And you think, oh, well, I did less reps a set, but look how many more sets you've done, right? And it's the same weight. So therefore, you're actually doing pretty much like 1,000 pounds more of weight. So to do the math, what's the difference in week 8 versus week 1? Anyone do the math? 6750. Yeah, thank you, Evan. Minus 5625. And you might get questions like this on an exam as well. So we're comparing now. In week 8, they did basically 1,000 pounds more volume. So this could have been a 8-week program or 8-week plan where we're progressively increasing the volume of the bench press, but we're manipulating our sets and reps differently. Doesn't always mean we might have to go up in weight, okay? But again, you might go up in weight as well. So it depends how we're manipulating the programming. Are we increasing load? If we increase load, then we're going to have to decrease probably the repetitions a little bit. Are we going to keep the sets the same? So just all things to consider. Again, this is more what we would focus on in PT2 a little bit, but just to keep in mind, understanding what load volume is and how to calculate it. Okay, and understanding, you know, when we're looking at differences, okay, well, you know, if you just were to eyeball it and take a look at week 1 and 8, you might think that, you know, week 1 you did more, but if you actually do the math, like 5 sets of 5 reps, it's only 25 versus 30 reps of the same weight. Well, you're probably going to do more in week 8, right? So understanding what load volume is and how to calculate it is important. And again, here is the answers, and I'll clear my drawings. Okay, so exactly the answers we've got, which is great. Okay. So when we're looking at volume, okay, so we said for a beginner, it's okay to do 1 set. Okay, for someone who's untrained, doesn't have much experience, it's okay to do 1 set. Okay, and that might be okay for the first couple 2 to 3 months of training, and then eventually you might start adding another set in. Okay, now if your goal is to increase strength, okay, so get stronger, lifting more weight over time, especially for someone who's more intermediate to advanced, we're going to need some volume increases. So you can't always do 2 sets of 5, 3 sets of 5, or 2 sets of 6, 3 sets of 6, or just keeping the same sets and then keeping the reps obviously under 6. You're going to plateau at some point. You need to start increasing sets, and that will promote further gains in strength. Okay, you might not change the rep schemes for some weeks, but you do need to eventually increase the sets. Okay, and that will help promote gains in strength. Okay, so that is important as well for someone who's advanced. Okay, so beginners, it's okay to do 1 set. For someone who's advanced, 1 set is probably not enough stimulus, and over time you will have to add more sets. And we said over 3, right? So that could be 5 sets. You might be doing 10 sets of 3, right? That's still following strength because you're doing less than 6 reps, right? You might be going with heavier weights because you're only doing 3. You might not need 10 sets, but you might do 8 sets of 3, for example. It depends. You might do 5. There's not one way to do everything. Just as we know with programming, it's not black and white. Okay, so did I not just say that? I think it's just repeated here. But again, as we said, I hope you get it now, but for beginner clients, 1 to 2 sets is enough. Okay, and as they become more trained, then we can start adding more. Okay, so 1 set's enough. Eventually add 2. And eventually, as they progress and work up to more intermediate level, we can now add a third set and potentially more if needed. Usually 3 is still good to promote stimulus. Okay, so let's say a client is doing more like endurance type of stuff and like circuits. 3 sets might just be enough to continue with stimulus. But if you do notice that the client is plateauing, then you might want to maybe add another set. But understanding the more sets you add, if you have 8 exercises, it's going to take a long time to do like 4 or 5 sets of 8 exercises. So it might just be those core exercises that you might be adding some extra sets, or you might do some supersets and you do like 4 sets of your superset. Let's say you're doing like a superset between, I don't know, bicep and tricep, for example. And so you could do 4 sets of that and take less rest. Like that won't take long. But if you have like a circuit that you're doing and you decide to add another set, that might add another like 15 minutes to your workout. So again, it depends on how that affects the timing of the workout as well, how we manipulate our sets over time. So depending our goal is going to depend on our training volume. So here is, it's basically a review of what we've gone through. So there's no new information here, but we're looking at just the sets, right? And so this is kind of a similar chart to what you looked at, but now we just see only sets and repetitions. And we can see for someone who is beginner, we see 1 to 3 sets is enough, and intermediate, greater equal to 3. Also for someone who's looking to stimulate muscle growth and for hypertrophy, as we mentioned about hypertrophy, again, we're looking between somewhere 6 to 12 reps. For someone who's more intermediate advanced, you might be looking at like 5 sets of some exercises to really fatigue it if you wanted to. So some bodybuilders might be doing like 8 sets of an exercise or 2 different exercises that target the same muscle to really fatigue it, okay? Because the idea is with bodybuilding is we're really trying to fatigue those muscles so we can stimulate muscle growth, right? So you really need that volume to help you do that, okay? So again, this is all review. There shouldn't be anything new on this slide for you. So we're looking at different goals. So if your goal is strength or power, your volume will be lower, okay, for power than for someone who's doing strength training. And this is what we saw, right? We saw the sets kind of were capped at 6, the repetitions were capped at 6, right? And then the sets were like 1 to like 3 to 6 as well. So again, and we can go back here. So if we're looking at power, we see intermediate 3 to 6 reps, advanced 1 to 6, and then 1 to 3 sets for an intermediate, 3 to 6 sets for advanced for power. Okay, so you can see a little bit different. We have some caps here because the idea with power is we need to focus on a good technique and the quality of each repetition that you do. Whereas strength, you're just trying to lift as much weight as you can. Less really focus as much on, yes, you need to have good technique, but again, thinking of a power clean exercise versus a deadlift, the power clean will take a lot more technique than a deadlift would, okay? So volume assignments for power are lower than for strength. And also thinking of all the coordination and muscular coordination that goes into doing these power movements does take a lot out of you. So that's why usually Olympic lifters are not doing a high amount of volume because they will not be able to recover, okay? So for hypertrophy, usually 3 to 6 sets is what will help stimulate that muscle growth and increase in muscle size, okay? So higher volume, 3 or more exercises per muscle group, 3 to 6 sets each exercise. So can we just think for a moment of what that might look like? So let's say chest, okay? So 3 exercises for chest press, chest fly. Okay, so maybe a dumbbell chest press, and then a chest fly and a barbell bench press, chest press, whatever. So that's 3 different exercises that all hit the chest, or push-ups. You can pick up whatever, anything that hits the chest. So 3 exercises for the same muscle group, okay? and then 3 to 6 sets of all of each of those exercises. So that will stimulate some increases in muscle size because, as I said, the idea is to try and fatigue the muscle so we can then stimulate the growth, okay? So that is for hypertrophy, where we're looking at a lot higher volume, okay? Especially higher than strength. Then endurance, okay? So we can work at higher volumes for endurance as well, right? Because we're looking at lighter loads. And again, potentially fewer sets, usually because we're doing a lot more reps per set. So you might be doing 20, 30 reps a set, potentially, depending on what you're training for. So you don't need to do 5 sets of 30 reps. You'll be there all day, right? Whereas, someone who's training for strength, doing 5 sets of like 3 repetitions won't take as long as 5 sets of 30, right? So with endurance, we're going to see higher repetitions, much lighter weights, and we don't need as many sets. So you might see the most amount of sets for someone's goal of hypertrophy. And this is, again, closer to that like bodybuilding, where we're really trying to increase muscular size, okay? And so you really got to overload the muscles, as I've said, to stimulate those adaptations. Any questions about the different goals and what is recommended? Power is lower, okay, because we're focusing on the quality of the movement more. So again, a lot of muscular recruitment, motor unit recruitment, very fatiguing. So we're not doing as much volume. Won't be able to recover. Any other questions? Good question. So it's 4 o'clock. So I do want to take a break right now, if that's okay with you. We'll take like a 5-minute break just to take everything in and regroup. And then we're going to go into rest periods when we get back. Okay, so we'll take a 5-minute break. So let's say 4:08, unless you want to go 4:10, I don't mind making it even. I think I should be okay to finish by 5 with a Kahoot. So let's say 4:10. Okay, so we'll meet back at 4:10. Okay. Started. Okay, so again, I just want you to understand for volume, okay, beginner versus advanced and the different goals. So if we're looking at strength, we're going to see, again, lower volumes is like compared to hypertrophy. Power will be lower than strength. Hypertrophy will have high volumes. Muscular endurance will have moderate amounts of volume. Because you're doing more reps per set, you don't need to do as many sets as if, again, you're, let's say, doing hypertrophy. So again, understand the difference between load volume and repetition volume, know how to calculate it, and what the purpose of it is. Why do we care to look at load volume and volume? Okay, so that's kind of your summary about volume. And so that is, again, when we're looking at, okay, I've prescribed sets, I've prescribed my reps, I've prescribed my weight. Okay, that's great. But now how is this going to look over time? What am I going to manipulate? Am I going to change my sets? Am I going to play around with my reps? Am I going to play around with my weight? Right? Am I increasing my intensity? Is that what I'm trying to do? Okay, well, then my volume needs to go down. Am I increasing my volume? Okay, well, then intensity will go down. Did I even say that? And my brain, like what I'm saying. So I'll say it one more time. If, again, I'm looking at increasing my intensity, my volume has to go down. If I'm looking at increasing my volume, sorry. Okay, if I'm decreasing my volume, there we go. That's because now I'm saying it like just the same way backwards. My apologies. So if I'm decreasing my volume, then my intensity should be going up. Okay, if that's what I'm looking at. So again, understanding that one goes up, one has to go down. Okay, so let's look at rest periods. So when we're looking at rest, this is the time dedicated to recovering between a set. Okay, so I do one set, 10 reps. How much rest am I going to have before I start my next set? And so this is usually called your rest period or interset rest. And so the length of the rest is going to be determined by Again, what's your goal? How much load are you lifting? And then the athlete's training status. So if you're lifting really, really heavy loads, you're going to need to rest. Okay. You might feel like you're ready to go in a minute, but your body is not. Okay. Because understanding when we lift really heavy loads, we are recruiting a lot of muscle mass. Our brain and nervous system are firing to get all the muscles recruited. So it's actually very fatiguing on our nervous system. So that's why we need to rest. Okay. And for someone who might be a little bit more fit, okay, for strength, I would say you'll see again, it's 2 to 5 minutes. For strength across the board, no matter how fit you are, you're probably going to want to take that rest because of the central nervous system fatigue. Now, if we're looking at hypertrophy, when we're working with not as heavy weight and we're really trying to just burn out that muscle, if you take less rest, you will really burn out, right? And if that's what you're trying to do, then take less rest, right? And for someone who's looking for endurance, you're going to see less rest, because endurance is, how long can you sustain effort for a period of time? Well, if I take less rest, I could sustain more effort for a period of time. So when we're looking at the rest periods, and we've talked about these already, for muscular endurance, we're looking at less than 30 seconds. Again, the less the better, because that's a better indication of endurance. Okay, so if we're doing like circuit training, potentially, moderate loads, higher reps, you're going to take probably shorter rest, because we're not going that heavy and it doesn't take as much time for that nervous system to recover. Okay, and again, we're trying to improve our endurance. We don't want as long of a rest, or else our endurance won't improve. Hypertrophy, we can see anywhere between 30 seconds to 1.5 minutes. So again, depending on how fit you are, maybe if you're more fit, you'll take some shorter rest periods. But what are we trying to achieve, right? Are we really trying to fatigue the muscle? Then we might take some shorter rests. For power and strength, we see the same, 2 to 5 minutes. Okay, because again, we want to maximize the quality of each set. For strength and power, if we don't take enough rest, you will probably fail, or you're going to have bad technique and it's not going to look pretty. So you do need to rest. Whereas when you're working with lighter loads, if you're fatigued, yeah, it's just going to burn. Whereas if you're going heavy for a squat and you didn't rest long enough, that could lead to an injury, or you're going to fail the weight. Okay. So that's really important to understand. Okay. So again, what is rest? This is the time between each set of the same exercise or different exercises with the same muscle group within the same session. So what you might be doing, let's say, for example, a leg press machine. You might do 3 sets, 10 repetitions. You might be, so that's, let's say, hypertrophy, endurance-ish, right? So let's say it's for hypertrophy, 3 sets of 10 reps. We're going heavy, heavy-ish, right? So I might, then take a 30, let's say, or 60-second break in between each set. So I do my first set of leg press, take a minute break, do another set, take a minute, do my third set. You could do it like that. You could do it as a sequence of exercises. Again, depending how you're doing it, you might do a leg press, and then let's say you're going to do upper lower split. So you might go and do an upper body exercise next. You might not need as much rest if we're working a different muscle group. Okay. So again, depends how you're doing it. I personally don't like to do one exercise, do my rest, okay, move on to the next exercise, because it just takes too much time waiting to rest between. I rather do a different exercise in between that targets different muscle groups, so I'm not wasting time. Depends what you're trying to achieve. If that's really what you're trying to do, then and you prefer that way, you could do your rest after each set if you really wanted to. Understanding as well, for someone who's untrained in that beginner level, might need even more rest than what's recommended. Okay, so if they are working at endurance, which most likely they are, the recommendation's 30 seconds, they might need a minute, minute and a half or more rest, right? So understanding, depending on their cardiovascular endurance level, if it's very poor, then they might need quite a bit of rest between some exercises, and that's okay. Give them the rest. And this is where I do recommend as well alternating muscle groups, so they're not doing like 3 leg exercises back to back. That's going to be really fatiguing for a beginner client. I hope that makes sense as we go look at this. Any questions about the rest? And feel free to read like the fine print here. Again, it's a guideline, used with caution. Technique is so important. So, you know, if let's say you took your rest, but that's compromising your technique because you didn't rest long enough, then increase your rest time. Okay. And again, depending on the individual, they might need more rest, especially for someone who might be a beginner client. Okay. All right. If anyone has questions, you're more than welcome to type in the chat. I will read your question. So let's look at training variation. So this is now going into when we look at a program over time, why do we care about variation? Okay, so lots of important things, right? So this is not doing the same workout every day for 3 months and that's it, right? We need to add variation. So variation of exercises, how we perform them, and that's what we're looking at. So this is going to lower the risk of overtraining, lower your risk of injuries, relieve boredom because clients can get bored doing the same thing all the time, maintain your intensity, okay, even with adding variation, stimulate your muscle groups in different ways, and keep improvement happening. So it's very important to add variation in the program. Vary how you do a squat, vary how you do a lunge, vary how you do a row, vary how you target your shoulders. Are you always doing a shoulder press? Are you always using dumbbells, right? So adding variation is what is going to be another key factor when you're looking at adapting a client's program over a period of time. So volume, yes, is important, but we also need variation. So if your goal was to improve your back squat, your barbell back squat, just training the barbell back squat is not going to help, okay? And only doing that. You need to do variations of the squat because that will help target your weaknesses, which will then actually help improve you to get stronger. So even doing front squats, even though it's going to target your legs a little differently, it will actually still help your back squat. So this is important to know different variations of the same exercise so we can add that into a client's program. So how do we create variation? So not only is it, you know, changing the exercise and doing a different variation of squat. So what are some things we can do? So again, not only are we maybe manipulating the physical stimulus, but also the mental stimulus. So again, what exercise? That's fair, right? That's what we're talking about. So changing the exercise. How often are you doing it? Are you only squatting once a week and your goal is to improve your squat? Maybe move it to twice a week, right? So adding some change in frequency. Changing the order of your exercises. There's not one way to order exercises. It's okay to change things up and maybe manipulate your order, okay? Change the load. Obviously, doing the same load for a long period of time, you will plateau. That's an obvious one, but there is a point where it does get tricky to increase load for a client who's more advanced, right? Where it's harder to make huge increases in weight. But then we could start playing around with volume. We could play around with rest periods. Again, being careful with rest periods when we're looking at strength, because again, it is important to rest, but you could maybe, let's say, do your squat, heavy squat for 5 repetitions, and then maybe do an upper body exercise in between, or an ab exercise, or something that's hitting different muscle groups. So you're not just sitting around and looking at the clock, because I don't know, I find that's a waste of time at the gym. I'd rather be using my time wisely, especially if you only, let's say, have an hour. I don't want to be sitting around for 30 minutes as my rest period, right? And so you might see people at the gym sitting, you know, waiting, maybe socializing as well in between sets. Okay, great, but I'd rather be efficient, might as well do something else while I'm waiting that won't really affect my ability to do my next squat, okay? So again, variety within my workout. So again, what equipment am I using, right? Might be important, okay? And then, you know, different variations of what I'm doing with it. So again, that's manipulating my order, manipulating anything within that same workout, my reps, my sets, whatever I'm manipulating. And then when we look at, you know, a period of time, so up to like, let's say a 6-month period, how am I changing it up across different workouts? Do I have a heavy day? Do I have a light day? Am I doing upper lower body split? Am I splitting it by muscle groups? So you can play around with that. You might do like a 3-month block of, let's say, 2 days upper, 2 days lower body. And that's what you did for 3 months. And then your next 3-month block, you could actually then switch it to muscle groups. And so I'm going to do chest and back day. I'm going to do a leg day. I'm going to do a shoulders and arms day, for example, and changing it by muscle groups. So you can play around with how your weekly schedule looks. And so you might have a heavy day and light days. You might have a moderate day, which is, again, you're not going to go heavy every day, as we've talked about, if you're doing strength. So playing around with that and how it's going to look across different workouts over a period of time. So there's a lot of things that you have to look at. And again, it does take practice, it does take experience. And if you do work out yourself, it does really help to understand, okay, how can I now manipulate what I'm doing to see progressions over time still, okay? Any questions about variation before I move on here? Does that make sense? Any questions? Just want to make sure we're following. All good, Max? Okay. So again, this is all kind of, we're talking about it theoretically. We're not really going to apply it as much till next semester, okay? And you still need to learn a lot more resistance exercises as well to be able to think about this too. Okay, so let's move on to sequencing. And again, this is more so into PT2, but you know, this is still a step as we're looking at program design. So general rule, as we said already, is someone should start with muscular endurance, potentially hypertrophy, depending on where they're at, but we need to establish a base. Okay, so you need to build a good solid base before we start adding weight and getting heavier. So they should be starting a program, as we talked about, most likely with muscular endurance. So like 10 to 15 reps, 2 to 3 sets, build up to that. And then we can start playing around with some other variables and maybe moving to more hypertrophy, heavier weights, and maybe progressing to strength or something like that. So what determines how we sequence? Well, the client's goal. What are they trying to achieve? Do they not care to get to strength? Well, then we're going to probably just stick between muscular endurance. So is their goal to build muscle mass? Okay, well, then eventually we're going to progress to hypertrophy. So usually when we look at a phase or a time frame of when we're creating a plan for someone, usually it'll probably last about 2 to 4 weeks. And we might be playing around with some volume and intensity, but you could keep the exercises very similar. Again, programming starts to get very complex. You can literally do a whole course on programming, but typically you could stick with the same plan for 2 to 4 weeks and the client will adapt, and then we start needing to switch. Okay, so after 4 weeks, we start seeing adaptation start to slow because our body will get used to the demand that we put on it, right? So this is where, okay, now we need to start playing around with variation and what we're trying to do in the program. So after 4 weeks, you could start playing around with the goal. So you could shift into muscular strength for another block of 2 to 4 weeks. You could shift to hypertrophy and play around. And so this is looking at like different blocks, okay? And so then after, let's say you've done, so let's say you did a 2 to 4 week block of hypertrophy, and this is an intermediate client. So you did a 2 to 4 week block of hypertrophy. We can now do a 2 to 4 week and 5 week, whatever, that's still very similar, but a 2 to 5 week block of strength, and then a 2 to 5 week block of back to hypertrophy. And we can keep alternating, okay? Now, another thing to think about too, and we talk more about this next semester, but we also need deload weeks over time. And again, depending how intense the workouts are, you can't just keep increasing indefinitely and never take a break and like a lighter week. So there's going to be usually every 4th week or so, you will take a deload week, which is like a decrease in intensity, and volume might be decreasing as well at that time. And that is a way to kind of just give your body a chance to recover and not get overtrained and reduce the risk of injury. And then we come back and we go into like a next block. So every 4th week or 5th week, you might be doing that like deload. And so that's why we can see like split up into like 4-week blocks, which is like a month, and then you take a week off, and then you go into the next month, and then you could continue that way. You might have 8-week blocks too, right? So really depends. There's not one way to sequence it. Okay, I don't want to confuse you, but understanding depending on, you know, how long we're looking at, we might be playing around with different time frames. Okay. So there will be a picture that will come up, which might help as well just to see. But let's say some examples here. My client's goal is strength. So what I would do, and if again, they still need to build strength, I would start with a block of hypertrophy, 2 to 4 weeks, and then we could do some maximal strength training for another block for 2 to 4 weeks. And so we can keep sequencing that, and then we're probably going to have a deload in between the hypertrophy and the strength training. So again, we're kind of building a good base, right? Higher volume, lower intensity. And then as we get to strength, we're going to go higher intensity and the volume will go down. And then we're going to work with heavier weights as we get to max strength training. So that is an example of how you could sequence that. Now, if let's say the client's goal is maximum power, then you might sequence it that a little differently. I might go to hypertrophy first, build that good base, move to maximal strength. And once I have that good base of strength, I can move to power. Okay. And so how is this beneficial? Why do we care to maybe start with hypertrophy? Is because we can get better improvements in strength if we get that underlying muscle adaptation first. Okay. And getting that increase in muscle mass with hypertrophy will actually still translate to improvements in strength. Okay, so that's why it does help to do periods of hypertrophy. So if a client's goal is strength, then hypertrophy is still okay to do. So that's important to think about too. We might be doing that, as I said, in blocks of like 2 to 4 weeks. So another example, if my goal was hypertrophy, I could do 4 weeks of hypertrophy followed by 3 weeks of strength, followed by again another 4 weeks of hypertrophy. The strength component will still help improve hypertrophy. Remember when we looked at that image, there's a lot of overlap, right? So, you know, if I were to stop at 10 reps, am I in endurance, am I hypertrophy? There's that overlap, right? And so, you know, if you are doing sets of 8 reps, you're still going to get improvements in strength if you're doing sets of 8 reps, which is technically hypertrophy, right? So understanding that it's not like you hit a cutoff and you're doing more than 6 reps and now, oh, well, I'm not going to get adaptations for strength. You still will, okay? So if you alternate between some strength and hypertrophy, this will actually produce greater increases in your hypertrophy and strength rather than only focusing on hypertrophy. Okay, so if my goal is hypertrophy and I just did 16 weeks of only hypertrophy, I actually won't get probably as strong and that same adaptation of hypertrophy if I didn't include some strength in there. I hope that makes sense, that you should add some periods of strength even if your goal is hypertrophy, and vice versa. If your goal is strength, the hypertrophy will help, right? Because that's going to help build some muscle size, and that will also help your strength. As we know, one is not going to like stop the other from happening, right? And even if the client's goal was muscular endurance, if you did hypertrophy, still going to help endurance a bit if you're in that higher rep range, right? So understanding that it's good to be alternating between the different types of goals. So that's hypertrophy, strength, and endurance, right? Just because your goal is strength, that doesn't mean you should never do anything for endurance. Okay. I hope that makes sense. And again, it does help the more experience you have with training and understanding, what programming might look like. So here's just some examples. And again, we talked about like 2 to 4 week blocks. And then we can see here, we're looking at heavy to light weeks. And I mentioned, and I'll type the word for you, deload. When we talk about light weeks, we call that a deload week. And so when we say deload, that means basically lighten the load, lighten the volume, and just kind of take it easy. Doesn't mean go sit on the couch for a week. It just means you can still work out, but I'm not going to go as hard. just kind of a maintenance and lowered my intensity a bit, lower my volume a bit. So I kind of recover, and you might reduce your frequency that week. That's okay. And that's going to give your body the time to recover, adapt to the training, and you will come back stronger. Okay. So that's what we talk about, like ratio of heavy to light weeks. So we can see like 2 to 3 weeks heavy, 1 week light. So it's usually a 1 week deload. Okay. Again, unless you went really, really, really hard for your heavy weeks, you might need a little longer, but usually a week is good. So most of the time when we're looking at the different phases, so whether it's endurance, hypertrophy, strength, again, we're looking at like 2 to 4 week blocks. Okay. So you might do it in a block where I do a endurance block, then a hypertrophy block, and then a strength block. And they're like 3 weeks each, followed by a 1 week recovery or deload week. Okay. And in this case, they call it an unloading week. I call it a deload week. It's the same thing. So if you read the bottom, they call it unloading, but it's really a deload. Okay. So again, when we're looking at sequencing, how might that look? Okay, I hope that makes sense. So here's kind of like a flow chart of what you might do for different goals. So whether it's endurance focus, hypertrophy focus, or strength focus, and so some different blocks and what they might look like. And again, you still might have those 1 week deloads in between. So we can see for muscular endurance, you might do a block of endurance, followed by a block of strength, followed by a block of endurance, followed by a block of strength. Again, the strength is not going to negatively impact your endurance, but it will help you to be stronger. So endurance, when you go back to it, you'll feel stronger when you're going through your muscular endurance repetition ranges. Okay, and you could alternate between endurance and hypertrophy too. If we go to hypertrophy focus, for example, we're looking at, like, for example, 4 weeks hypertrophy, 3 weeks strength, 4 weeks hypertrophy, 2 weeks strength. And again, varying the blocks that way between hypertrophy and strength. And as we said, strength will still help with hypertrophy. And then looking in the last example, hypertrophy, strength, and power included as well for a client's goal of improving strength. Okay, so just looking at different ways that we can kind of phase it over a period of time. These are 16-week programs, so that would be like 4 months as an example. Okay. All right, so when we're looking at progression over time, okay, so sequencing again is important, and then how are we going to progress? Remember, variation is important, but we still need to make sure they're progressing in volume and intensity in some way. Okay. So if, again, we are not progressing, we will plateau. So we can increase our stimulus by increasing how many times we're training a week, if possible, increasing the number of exercises, if possible. Most of the time, you could probably add more. And again, the more efficient you get, it'll take you less time to do the workout, ideally. So therefore, you could add more exercises, add some sets, increase the speed of the movement, so focusing on some speed, a little bit of power potentially, increasing the load, decreasing your rest periods. Again, shorter rest periods will make it harder. For strength, I might not recommend that if you are going heavy. And then again, as we talked about, variation in doing difficult versions of exercises. So that could be, doing some stuff unilaterally. You could do again, adding a weight, a different type of load to the exercise. So again, adding a barbell or dumbbells, right? Using a TRX for some exercises. And so just changing it up and adding some different variations and difficult versions of an exercise. So even, let's say you're doing an assisted pull-up machine, you might then progress to doing pull-ups with a band. And that's a difficult version of doing it with the machine, for example. Okay. So if we think of progression, it should not be envisioned as a staircase. So, oh, well, yeah, I'm going to increase the load. I'm going to increase the load over time, and it's just going to be a staircase, and this is going to be beautiful. I will be able to squat 1,000 pounds in 2 years. Unfortunately, a staircase is not going to be the best way to think of progression. There will be times where you will feel weaker. There will be times you feel stronger, and that's normal. And again, I would say the most important thing with training is consistency. So being able to maintain consistent, workout routine over a period of time, that's where you're going to see the most improvements. Okay. So there's a rule of kind of when we can maybe start adding weight. It's called a 2-for-2 rule. So how do we know when the client's ready to add weight, right? Because it's like, oh yeah, well, let's just add weight, right? Well, it might be a little harder than just saying that. So here's the rule. So if you can perform 2 or more repetitions over the assigned repetition goal at this, excuse me, sorry. I don't know what's going on. Okay, let's repeat that. So if an athlete can perform 2 or more repetitions over their assigned repetition goal for a given exercise, in the last set of 2 consecutive workouts, we can now add weight the next session. Okay, so let's do an example. So let's say the client was doing a dumbbell chest press. So that's the exercise. So they were doing 3 sets of 12 reps for each time they were doing it. Okay, so that means that the last 2 workouts in the 3rd set, they could do 2 or more reps. They did 15, let's say. Okay, therefore, I'm ready to maybe add some weight. And let's say they were doing this with 20 pounds. I might go up to 25 pounds next if they're ready. There are some dumbbells that are 22 and a half. You could go there next if that's feasible. Okay, so again, last 2 workouts, they were able to do 2 more repetitions in the last set. Okay, so the 3rd set, they could still do more reps. Then it's getting easy. We can now add weight. So that's called the 2-for-2 rule. Okay. Oops. Okay. So how much weight should we go up? And so there's kind of like a rule of thumb of, whether you're looking at bigger muscle groups or smaller muscle groups. So usually if we're looking at core multi-joint movements like squats, bench, deadlift, we can increase the load more frequently. For someone who is also including those assistance movements with single joint movements, we're going to have smaller increases in load less frequently. So triceps, biceps, shoulders, we're not going to be able to increase load as frequently as if, let's say, we're doing like a squat or a deadlift. So if we take a look at this chart here, we can just see some examples of, depending on the exercise that we're doing, if we're doing upper body or lower body exercises, we're going to see lower body, we can go up more weight. Okay, and again, this could be in a month. It depends on, again, that status of the client and how we're progressing, but 5 to 10 pounds at a time might be feasible for a client. And again, this is for someone who might be smaller, weaker, and less trained. And then upper body, 2.5 to 5 pounds would be smaller load increases. Okay. And then for someone who might be more trained, more well-conditioned, larger size, okay, we might see more ability to increase weight at that time. So instead of a 5 to 10 pound increase for lower body, we're going to see like a 10 to 15 pound increase possible. And then that's for lower body. And for upper body, like 5 to 10 pound increase each time. Okay, they're increasing load. And again, for someone who's more advanced, it might be harder to increase load as frequently than someone who is a beginner as well. That's something to think about, right? Because as we get to near our genetic potential, it's much harder to continually add load. So you might get to the point where you get to a bicep curl and it's like really hard to then keep increasing load for it. That's where you start manipulating your repetitions and the sets, right? And the variation of the exercise when load is no longer an option. Okay. Okay, so we're almost there. I know, I'm sure it has been a gloomy day that some of you hopefully are still there with me. But when we are talking about progressing, again, we're not always just going up in weight when we're trying to progress a client. So I don't know what happened there, but increasing sets, reps, or weight. Okay. Again, it's not always about going up in weight. We can play around, add another set. We can manipulate our reps. Do the same amount of volume in less time, more work in the same time. So if you're able to complete more exercises, more reps, more sets in a period of time, well, that's a good thing. That's showing that you are improving and your fitness is improving. Changing your position. Okay, so you might be doing exercises in a different position. Changing your hand or foot width, your angles, your body position, your range of motion of different exercises. We'll do this more in the lab as you learn more exercises. What type of resistance are you using? Change it from machines to cables to free weights to barbells to dumbbells to TRX, stability ball, whatever, right? So there's so many options, and changing it up will definitely give you some more adaptations. Playing around with the tempo. How fast are we able to move that weight? Maybe let's move with speed, or maybe let's focus on slowing it down and going slower. Going from bilateral to unilateral, trying some single leg variations. So like a split squat, right? Where we're doing like a Bulgarian split squat where the back foot is elevated onto a bench, and we're doing like it's basically a variation of a lunge. We're doing a pistol squat, right? For example, doing single arm shoulder flies, for example, right? So playing around and maybe doing some unilateral movements, definitely beneficial, especially working on weaknesses. Perhaps adding some balance into it as well, and some more compound movements. The compound movements are what give you those adaptations and those results. Okay, so if you're only doing like one compound movement a workout, you might want to start adding more, right? And or the client, whoever we're referring to. So that's also important to make sure you're doing enough compound movements. So again, those are like your core movements, your squat, your chest or bench press, however you're doing like a press, your rows, your deadlift, right? You should be, everyone should have some variation of those exercises in their program. So that's important as well. Okay, so kind of just a review of what we have talked about of the different steps. Okay, and so the last ones we talked about, again, it's all just talking about it theoretically. We're not really going to adapt it yet, but this is more into personal training too. When we go into more about, okay, what are some examples of variation? How can we sequence a plan? What are some examples? Let's take a look at that. And then progressing, you know, a client over time, what might that look like? Okay. So again, we'll go through that more in PT2. So that concludes this week, which is part 3. And next week is reading week, which means we don't have any lecture. We don't have any labs, which is awesome. I hope you get a nice break. And after reading week, we will go into cardiovascular training methods, as I said, and talk about cardiovascular training. So kind of shift our focus a little to that. Now it's up to you. I know a lot of people look like they've left. Do you still want to do a Kahoot? If not, it is posted for you to do on your own. Okay, Evan, that's one. Okay, I can get that set up for you. Okay, let's stop sharing. Let's bring a new share. Let me just get it open. Do we see Kahoot? Get the music going. Is that everyone? Good, one more minute. Anyone else? All right, Sarah. Okay, let's start. Okay, I believe it's like 13 questions. So let's go for it. All right, that's again 5 repetitions. That's going to be strength. Okay, so that's 2 to 5 minutes. Good job. They can have longer rest periods. Good. It is the client's goal that will determine how you sequence their program. Awesome. Muscular endurance, 30 seconds or less. They are lower. We talked about that, right? A lot of focus on technique and lots of motor unit recruitment, lower volume. So think of an exercise that would be harder than a body weight squat if you can think of one. There's no right or there's no wrong answers for this. I don't think you're going to lose points. What is a harder way to do a body weight squat? So think of like adding some form of a weight, maybe making it unilateral. Changing tempo, adding a jump. Those are some examples I'm giving you. Let's see what we came up with. Dumbbell, back squat or front squat, single leg squat, jump, increase the number of reps. Good. All of those are ways you can progress the client performing a body weight squat. Awesome. So again, just adding weight, doing single leg, jumping, changing tempo, all those different examples. Good, that is low volume. Good, false. Less frequently is the correct answer. Three to six. Remember, we did, there was a slide that did mention that. So, and again, anything more than three, but we said 3 to 6 sets of each exercise is going to be for an advanced client where their goal is hypertrophy. So that is a clean, that picture, that's Tia to me. So that is a power movement, Olympic lifting movement. We will not do that in the lab. Just too hard. What did you pick? Yeah. Oh, no one chose volume? That was the answer. Volume is determined by the number of sets. That was like right at the beginning of their presentation. No one got it. This is true. So anything we talked about, how could you add variation? See what we got. Increase the weight, increase or decrease reps, add equipment like dumbbells or TheraBand. Good. Endurance. Yeah, I mean that, okay, well, there's a lot for that one. So changing like the sequencing, frequency, type, loads, awesome, all great. Yep. So again, those are definitely ways we can play with variation. Good. Good job. Good. Endurance. Awesome. All right, that was the last question. E4. Evan, good job. Good job, Zara. Awesome. Great job. Thank you for sticking around to the end, for those of you who participated. So we'll stop that. Okay, so that's it for today. Does anyone have any questions?